It's a delight to be here. I could talk about plants, especially native plants, night and day for my entire life. My poor children had to escape with my husband because they hear me talk about native plants so much. So I know I don't look like your traditional professor. I don't have tweeds and beards, but I think that stereotype has left. I just got my 10-year pin at Colorado State University. Thank you. I'm very delighted by that. I'm so proud of it. And I've had an opportunity to work with a colleague. You can't see the names up here, but I'll show you a little bit more. That actually retired in 1990. That has worked in native plants since 1953, when he graduated with his PhD from Iowa, University of Iowa. So I'm going to just tell you a little story and talk about native plants. If you're from Moab here, you already do some really great stuff with native plants. One of my absolute favorite native plants, which is the cover of that book, and I actually just got it tattooed on my foot last month. That picture was taken actually just on the other side of the Colorado border, near Montrose, when we were publishing this book originally. And so that's a patchy plume, Pelusia paradoxa, and you all here do an awesome job with I always talk about Moab every time I talk about this plant, because you know how to prune it here. Somebody does. Somebody's really good at that. So I know Sharon said hold your questions. I don't have 60 slides, and I prefer a little bit of interaction. And then if we have long scenario questions, we can talk about that at the end. How does that sound? Sorry, I'm going against the rules. Yes?
What does the flower look like?
So the flower looks like a white rose flower. That's a single petal. It doesn't have multiple petals like a red rose. It's like a wild rose, except it's white.
Oh, okay.
So I think I have a picture of it later on. So my journey with native plants started about 25 years ago with actually native maize. And so these are just some pictures of some I actually grew recently. That's my first illustration in 1999 as a master's student or something around there, as I worked on corn. And I grew up in Iowa, went to Iowa State, did my undergrad and master's there, later went to Colorado State University for my PhD. And so I'm a hiker, I'm a major gardener. I ripped out actually a turfgrass front lawn and replaced it with a dry creek bed, all native. I left the giant tree up there, but I pulled all the turf grass out and replaced it with a walkway and a dry creek bed. I've worked in extension in 2 states, so I've talked to a lot of the public, especially Colorado Master Gardeners, but then also the public that contacted them about Colorado native plants. We've actually put on in Colorado, I'll keep saying Colorado native plants, but I'm sorry, really it's Southwestern native plants that I want to try to remember to say tonight. But we've put on several symposia. We have one that's going to be in February, towards the end of February. It's our 9th or 10th Landscaping with Native Plants conference. And we have an incredible speaker, David Inouye, who has spent his career looking at how native plant and native pollinator populations have changed over time. So he was a professor at University of Maryland, did all of his work in Gothic, Colorado in the summers, and is going to be our keynote. And actually, the endnote speaker is from Fruta, so not terribly far away from here, Kenton Seth. He is a very well-known native landscaper in sort of this greater region. All of my research, it relates to green roofs, so growing plants on rooftops. I'll just show you a couple images. I won't go into it too much since that's not the topic of the talk today. I also used to work for the Colorado Native Plant Society. If you're not aware, you have an awesome Utah Native Plant Society too. I recommend you look them up and join them. When we published our book a few years ago, we got a great thorough review from the president at the time of the Utah Native Plant Society, And we have sold a ridiculous amount of books in this state. It's wonderful. I've also done a lot of research. These are all native plants, Western native plants in containers. They're not necessarily very well known for gardening practices all over the West. And so we were looking at a project I'll mention a little later, research on trying to get them to look a little better. Is it drainage? Is it a mycorrhiza? What is it that gets them to look better in containers? So we did a study on that. So real briefly, as Sharon mentioned at the beginning, they have several copies of our book. I actually just signed probably about 20 of them, Common Southwestern Native Plants. In fact, Sam, who does the ordering for all of the Canyonlands bookstores, said it's their #1 selling plant book. So we sell a bunch at Arches, Canyonlands. I think they even supply to a couple in Southwest Colorado. So it's the 3rd edition of this book. What we did was we doubled the herbaceous plant section. So my mentor, Jack, who's the first author I mentioned at the beginning, he was a woody plant guy. So he loved his trees and shrubs, anything that had overwintering above ground stems. And I'm much more of an herbaceous person, so I brought in a ton more of the herbaceous plants. But then it's funny, because my first tattoo is a woody plant. So I learned a lot. I've actually now, since I'm working on my 4th book, all as a co-author, and it's absolutely wonderful. All proceeds of this book go to the Colorado Native Plant Society, so it goes to a good cause. They're the ones that fronted the money for it, and they make all of the money. So I'm just an academic, and my husband yells at me because he's in consulting, and he's like, "You just never want to make money." I'm like, "No, I'm an academic." And then, so this is Jack. This is his entire list of books up until he unfortunately passed away. We were working on updating his Trees and Shrubs in New Mexico at the time of his passing. So we have, and right now I'm working on Trees and Shrubs of Colorado. So that one's a big overhaul. It's been a couple years in the process. So the really incredible thing, Jack was a botanist, and botanists they study plants. Horticulturalists cultivate plants. So a lot of people think they're the same thing, but they're actually very different in practice. And we tease each other all the time. We would tease each other constantly. I'd be like, "Oh, that's a botanist thing. That's going on." And he's like, "Oh, you horticulturalists, you're so wishy-washy about your plants, your plant names." But he was just an incredible mentor, major gardener, even all the way up to 91, and a systems thinker. So he totally changed my life. So I'd love to just give him a nod. This is where I really fell in love with native plants. It was about 15 years ago. There's some blue grama right here, Bouteloua gracilis. I'm taking pictures of some others. This is a cactus right here. But I'm actually in Denver on the 7th story of the Environmental Protection Agency Region 8 headquarters right there. And that green roof actually is only 4 inches or 10 centimeters deep, super shallow. So guess what kind of plants can do well in those conditions? Native plants. So we found some incredible specimens for that use, and it just blew my mind. I mean, I had been a plant person since literally I can remember, because I grew up on a farm and dissected plants from before I even knew what they were called. And so it was pretty amazing. I feel like this keeps going ahead on me. So I get to joke that I've even got to be a cover girl in my science. In Hort Science. So I'm measuring right there, blue grama. This is an Eriogonum, so you have several Eriogonums here. Sulfur flowers are their common names, that I'm measuring their growth rates over time. Even took a little home. There's a few non-natives in here too, but grasses. This is another grass. This is buffalo grass, or buffalo grass right there, sorry. So I mixed. At that time, I still wasn't 100%. This is a salvia, so a frigida, one of our sages. And then I helped with one of the first green roofs in Denver Metro. That's been about 15 years ago now. It's actually at the Denver Botanic Gardens. It's above their cafe, if you've ever been to that Botanic Gardens. It's one of the most diverse green roofs in North America. It's only really beat by this one, which is actually a full acre of green roof with 600 taxa. Over half of those plants are native to the Southwest. So
both of those roots were a lot deeper, right?
Not this one.
Not 4 inches.
This is all 4 inches right here. There's one mound where there's some shrubs, but these are just Icomopsis. You have a bunch of Icomopsis out here too.
And they're 4 inches?
Yeah. And they sort of colonized. They're biennials. And they grow in a floret or a small rosette in the first year. And the second year they bolt and they flower like crazy and they shed seed everywhere. So it's like almost a monoculture. Now you have to dig for some of these other plants the last few years. So one of my graduate students actually had maintained this at the time this picture was taken, and we did his master's thesis research up here. So let's get to why native. I love that question, and that's the thing that I remind myself of all the time. In Colorado, we have 3,211 Colorado native plants. You're somewhere right in that same area too, between 2,500 and 3,500 native species. To your state, that's incredible diversity. The only other state that outdoes us is actually California in terms of North America. Now, Mexico's different. They have like 150,000 species native there. But in the US, it's not even 100,000 native species to the entire US. And of course, all those plants have different geographies they're native to. But it's a really a large amount of diversity in the West, and the primary reason is because we have such extreme environments that speciation, in theory, speciation occurred at a greater rate because all these plants had to find unique niches to survive in. So it's pretty incredible. But when I think about gardening, because I really want to bring native plants into cities, I'll talk about on the next slide. Nature doesn't have to be away from us. It doesn't have to be outside of town. It can be with us in cities. And so the couple of things I really love to talk about is really having to work with nature. So you do end up needing to amend your soils less, irrigate less. Not no irrigation, especially after you've transplanted, but irrigate less. Use fewer resources and provide more resources. So providing that pollinator habitat. So another statistic to mention, we have in Colorado, of course, honeybees. Those are non-native, they're European honeybees. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that's one species. We have 947 other native bee species. So those are almost all solitary bees. There's a few eusocial bees like bumblebees that will aggregate together, but nothing like the hives of honeybees. And so in order to provide the resources that all those specific species require, we need to build it for them. Because as humans, we're one species and we've taken up a lot of that space. Not that that's a bad thing, but if we can give back to a couple of those other species, why not? So the thing I always say, because I have all these lectures too on green roofs, food production, but my plants have to have a purpose. So they need to feed somebody, either pollinators or people. And so the incredible thing is if you provide pollinator habitat, whether it's 7 stories up or on the ground, they will come, they will find you. It's absolutely amazing. So this was one of my Native Plant Society members. She had mixed in a bunch of natives and non-natives together and had just a buzzing. I can hear what her garden sounded like when we did her garden tour this day in June of, I think, 2019. It was just pre-COVID. So I get a little excited, but it's really these things. And this is a shocking number. Up to 60% of municipal fresh water in western US is used for landscapes. Denver is one of the worst. I have to admit that. That's where I live. But that's a shocking number. We could get that down to a fraction of that percentage, as long as we're just not obsessed with our lawns. I have a tiny bit of lawn in the back because I have 2 little kids, 2 dogs. Absolutely, we need a little bit, but within reason. So this is a great book. This author, Doug Tallamy, any of you heard of him before? Raise your hands. Okay, so he's from out east, but his theories apply anywhere, pretty much anywhere in the world. His message is really what this title is, Bringing Nature Home. He has this great website that's called, oh, I should have thought to like double check its name. I think it's Home National Parks or something like that. You might have to Google him or search him up. But essentially what his message is, instead of having 40 million acres of turf grass in the US like we do right now, why don't we have most of that turned into essentially the largest national park in North America? Bring it back to a lot of what the native flora has been in those geographies, and then you can bring some of that nature back. So his big thing is birds. He loves birds. And to get to what equals birds, he actually spent 30 years, he's a professor at University of Delaware, and he spent 30 years, well his graduate students did, spent 30 years looking at what the birds who nested in areas actually ate. And he found that they were caterpillars. And they were up to 3,000 caterpillars a day for some species of birds to get to their hatchlings for that 6-ish week period when their hatchlings are trying to fledge. And so that's the critical thing he found. Well, you need, in order to have that abundance and diversity of caterpillars, you need to have native plants that they evolved on. So he actually went back and had all those graduate students track where the caterpillars came from too. And he found there's like a set of species. Of course, this is the east, and in Colorado we're trying to find out what the western version of it is. But essentially he found cornerstone species as far as oaks, prunus, so all the stone fruit types. They would have up to 300 species of caterpillars present on their foliage in the spring when the birds needed them. So to me, this is the biggest justification for the native plants, is to be able to get that entire ecosystem and that sweet fruit of being able to see those birds, right? My mentor, Jack, really finally got me to stop looking at just chlorophyll and turn and look at birds too. He's like, come on, Jen, there's more to it. So there's also, of course, the coevolution of natives. That whole native plants equal native bugs equal native birds. So our pollinators know how to use them. It is funny though, I've heard Doug Tallamy specifically say, because he gives talks all over, and he's been to the Denver Botanic Gardens like 3 or 4 times in the last 5 years. He was our keynote this last year at that landscaping conference I mentioned. And he didn't say this in front of his audience at that, but he basically said, well, pollinators will go to anything. It doesn't have to be just native plants. But what my graduate students data, because I have 2 graduate students looking at native plants versus non-native plants as resources on green roofs and on the ground. And the fascinating thing is we're seeing a greater, well, we see a ton of honeybees try everything. But we see a lot of our solitary bees only go to the native plants or the easy to grab non-native plants. So it has to do with access to that nectar that really allows them to be able to use it. So it's the specialist pollinators that we're excluding if we don't have a very dense native matrix of plants available for them. I get a little excited. So in my opinion, edge existing, I eat. I'm not one of those people that say we can only use native plants, because if we did, we wouldn't have much to eat right now. It would not necessarily provide enough resources for the populations we have, in the very least. Of course, you saw me show the Native American maize that I had studied originally thousands of years with very little additional inputs besides what was traded amongst tribes. But we're not at that population density anymore. We're much higher. So being realistic with all of that, my big thing is let's add native plants when we can to existing gardens. There's no need to be purist. So there is a big debate, and I get into it all the time. And I got so frustrated at a talk I gave recently in Colorado where we had a group of master gardeners and a group of native plant aficionados that came to my talk, and one of them kept heckling me about how, well, that plant's not native. And I'm like, yeah, it's a Colorado native plant. They're like, no, it's not native to this county. I was like, oh, okay, you're right, that's true. But it's so funny because I'm not native enough for about 10% of people, but I'm far too native planty for the other 90%. So I'm trying to be realistic, appeal to the masses. So I came up with this, and you don't have to memorize it or anything, but this little continuum to be able to explain the sort of magnitude of difference between native versus not native plants. So like I said, you don't have to memorize this, but essentially I go from the most extreme, native ecotype, which is literally native to that county, right, or native to even that landscape. And in some places, I know when I did a hike at Dead Horse Point State Park a couple years ago, I noticed a unique set of, I believe that one was a Fraxinus, so it was a single leaf ash. And it had some unique characteristics. So that's probably an ecotypic native, and that's a little higher elevation in some of the surrounding areas. So I suspected, in my not very scientific way, that it, could be a unique population that may not have those traits in any other populations around. So it was kind of cool. And you go all the way to the extreme of an invasive weed. So those are our noxious weeds. Those were required by federal law to control. And so this is, again, not very scientific, but we had to come up with this because the people see this as black or white all the time amongst the groups I work in. So like, for example, a regional native, there's a couple of plants I'm going to give as an example that are regional natives, so native to the entire southwestern region, but they're not native to that county like this master gardener, or this native plant aficionado was saying. A native cultivar, so a plant that's a named cultivar grown in horticulture trade and sold under a specific brand name, that's actually, some of my native plants folks don't love that because they think that's going to decrease the amount of genetic variability that's in that population. And that's true. But I think a garden is very different than wildlands. Wildlands, yes, we want to get as close to the native ecotype as we possibly can to maintain that area. But when you're gardening, I think you can move a little bit towards more of the domesticated. So this is where the big debate goes, is a hybrid. Because some of our plants, our native plants, can actually be hybridized with non-native plants if they were originally, maybe millions and millions of years ago, evolved from some of the same genetics. So they can actually cross-pollinate. So there's a big debate on whether they're valuable or not. I think, bring them in, let's be inclusive. I'm okay with that. So yes, defining native plants is not necessarily cut and dried. All right, so I did mention this in the beginning. And on the way over here, I realized I have not gotten a recent picture. This, I set up a talk about transforming my front yard to several groups, including our local Native Plant Society, and essentially how we, the process of removing the turf and all that. So that's a really fun talk, but one slide's probably enough to really get the gist of it. Where this is what it looked like when we bought it 10 years ago. I had added a bunch of plants in the rock area, but we removed all the rock. We dug a little Joy Creek bed, my husband's a stormwater engineer, so he wanted the idea of water without actually having to put a ton of water in the landscape. And then we went back after this and transplanted a bunch of native plants. So it's turned out to be something our neighbors love, which I was surprised about, because in all of Denver, if you've ever been there, everything looks like this, all over. That's the standard. I agree. So there's our design. One of my really good friends in the industry came up with a lovely design for our front yard. And we did it on our own. So I love this little talk. This was a talk we put together, some friends and I presented at one of our first of the Landscape with Native Plants conferences I've mentioned. And at the time I was still working for the Native Plant Society and then teaching part-time at CSU, and now I'm since full-time at CSU. But I love this little talk. It's approachable for any level of a person who's brand new to what native plants really are, all the way to very experienced. And this is just a jumping off point. So we literally went through and people say, well, this is what I see in the garden center. This is what the kind of look I want in my garden. And we give them an alternative that is native to the Southwest. So this is kind of a fun one. I'm just going to give a handful of examples. I'm not going to bore you to death with a ton of examples, but you can get creative and do some of the same things yourself, which is really exciting. And actually our book can help with that, if you would like. A lot of the plants in that book are, not all, but most are ones that are great in gardens because we selected them because they're easy to find in the Four Corners states. So Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. And so they're also usually pretty adaptable too, so they're really good for gardens for the most part. So I'll just give a couple of examples in each of these categories: trees, shrubs, perennials, and grasses. So in trees, if you go out east, you see silver maples everywhere. Well, a good alternative is actually our big-toothed maple. So Acer grandidentatum. You have in Utah some of the most beautiful examples of Acer grandidentatum in the world. So it has that beautiful maple leaf shape, no troubles with pH. A lot of the silver maples will actually get very yellow chlorosis on their leaves. A lot of the hybrid maples the same way, Freeman, Autumn Blaze, all those. But you don't get that, and because the plant's healthier, you get a really great fall color. So I was teasing my botanist mentor, Jack, because I said, Jack, I keep seeing Acer grandidentatum actually as our sugar maple, but a subspecies of it. So it's Acer saccharum, so that's just what sugar maple is. And then a subspecies grandidentatum. Do you botanists just need to keep yourselves busy? Is that it? So we rib each other good-naturedly like that. I'm just teasing. If there's any botanists, I'm really just teasing. We just love to rib each other. Have a little lighthearted banter. So instead of a hawthorn, we have another fantastic native plant, Tila trifoliata. It's a common hop tree. This is a plant in the Rutaceae family, so that's think citrus. And I have one of these in my front yard, and it smelled exactly like orange blossom when it bloomed this spring. So fantastic little plant. Beautiful glossy leaf. When you buy it at the nursery, it probably is going to look like poison ivy, just to warn you. So you might have to double check because the foliage looks almost the same. All right, a couple shrubs. Instead of Russian sage, it has its place in certain landscapes, not mine, because it's actually on our noxious weed watch list in Colorado. Is it in? Look, it's on the watch list. I'm not surprised. Here too. Good. I hope you don't. Make sure to go talk to the nurseries if they're going to sell it, because it becomes a problem. We have some grassland areas we cannot get it out of in the Front Range of Colorado.
It's hard. I have a bunch in my front yard. As soon as I got the house, I was gonna try to dig it out, and it just looks like it's just gonna be
It's going to be
horrible
a
to dig out.
beast. And everybody always said at the beginning when we first really introduced it in the trade at any kind of scale, they kept saying, oh, it's not going to reseed.
Oh.
So what's wrong with it? It's just
Yeah.
invasive,
It's great for bees.
hard to control.
It's great, especially for European honeybees, absolutely. It's beautiful.
Right.
And I'm not saying that, and I should have said that at the front, I'm not saying any of these are bad choices, but if you want to pick a good choice that's native. So I'm not saying that's a terrible plant. I will never grow it because I have seen it, it's even in my own neighborhood, it's starting to fill in all like the rocky gravel areas. It's so intense. But instead, this lovely plant, Amorpha canescens, is an incredible alternative. So it has a similar spiky look. It doesn't bloom as long. That is, I mean, there's realities like that. They are not the same, but they are, certainly there's some similarities. The one thing, this is a legume, and if you want to provide habitat for pollinators, a high diversity of them, that's a good group of plants to focus on because they have very high value, very sugary nectar and high protein pollen. And most solitary bees, when they lay their eggs in individual little chambers, most of the species, and some are in hollow stems, some are in the ground, they actually package some of the pollen and some of the nectar that they spit out of their crop into like a, oh, there's a name for it. It's honey bread, I think, is what it's called. They package it into a little pellet and they stick it in with their egg, and it doesn't degrade. So even if that egg doesn't hatch till next year, they come out and as larvae and can eat that before they pupate and then emerge as adults. So it's a pretty incredible thing to be able to provide both nectar and pollen resources, especially for our native bees. So everywhere you see orange is a whole bunch of anther shedding pollen. So this, if you go to High Country Gardens ever to order plants, you'll see this picture. It's one of mine. I took it and I was selling them some of our books, and they had seen this somewhere in one of my promo things, and they said, hey, could we buy that from you, that picture, so we can use it? And I was like, sure. And they gave me like a $50 gift certificate, and I turned around and spent $200. So they got a really good deal. So instead of Blumea Spirea, another bee magnet, absolutely bee magnet, but if you want an alternative, Desert 4 o'clock, Mirabilis multiflora, some of the best specimens I've ever seen have been in Colorado, or in Utah, I'm sorry. It's this like incredible ethereal color, and that gorgeous silvery mounting foliage. It's actually started to spread, not terribly aggressively in my own garden, so I'm digging up plants and handing them off to friends so we can spread the love. So instead of Forsythia, which always looks like it has wild hair like me, golden currant, Ribes aureum. I've seen many of these, and actually you have a prettier even leaf shape than this in some of your parks that I've seen. Super early yellow blooms. Some will have a clove scent and some are scentless. There's a big debate among some of my plant buddies on if we're actually naming the correct species, because this species, aureum, is not supposed to have scent, but we call it that in a lot of places. They think it's actually a different one. So we'll find out. They love to have their drama. And then there's lovely little fruit too, so either for birds or humans. So a few perennials. Instead of chrysanthemums, one that blooms at about the same time would be baby blue rabbit brush. In fact, this is a plant select plant, if you've ever heard of that program. And they collected some of the original seed from a genetically isolated group right on the past the Utah border from Fruita. And so that's where this baby blue comes from. Now, of course, you have tons of rabbit brush. People get sick of it. I get yelled at every time I get this talk and mention this. However, the great thing about this species is you can chop it down before or after winter. They don't really care. And it comes up nice and herbaceous instead of super gnarly woody. So the short-growing one is fantastic. So the city of Colorado Springs has totally figured out how to manage this plant. It just looks sensational. It blooms from July through October. And it looks great. And cut it back.
I have a question which
Yes.
you may not have an answer for, but rabbit brush tends to be an allergen for a lot of people. Would this also?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the yellow? I don't understand if it's baby blue.
So that's the foliage. This is the flower. Yeah.
Oh, the leaves.
That's the foliage, baby blue, and then the flower. Yes. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So. One time I was standing right next to this this plant with one of my buddies who's really interested in native plants too. Grew up in a ranch in south central Colorado. And we were standing there, we counted 9 species of bees on that plant. And we looked over and there was a Rosa Sharon and there was 1 species of bee on it. And it was covered in blossoms. It was just European honeybee. So I was like, there's our proof right there. Anecdotal. Instead of oregano, which of course has its uses, Monarda fistulosa. A couple of caveats with this plant. I mean, they really are like this. This picture I got off of SignNet, which is a great website if you're interested in Colorado or Southwestern Native Plants. They're out of Arizona, but they essentially, the 4 corner states are pretty much the major geography, including a little bit of Southern California, that they really focus on. So if you're interested in it, it's just SW as in southwestbiodiversity.org. And they have a whole bunch of fantastic images, including this one and most of the ones that I've talked about previous. And they also have a whole bunch of herbarium samples. So you can look at scanned in versions of what these plants look like in all their stages. So lovely fragrant foliage and flowers. It is also in the mint family, just like oregano. So it's covered in pollinators all summer as it blooms. Another caveat on this one, it gets powdery mildew really bad. But if you put it in a place of afternoon sun, you'll be in good shape. And if you do get an attack of powdery mildew, cut it back. It'll come back and be tougher. A couple of grasses. Instead of the almost ubiquitous miscanthus, Sargastrum nutans. You know, I didn't check if that is actually native here in Utah. I should have double checked that.
It's not, but it grows all in milk.
Okay, good to know. Oh, so is that a bad thing?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure how bad it is.
Yeah.
Compared to lavender grass, which is in there, it's not
Right.
bad at all.
Exactly, exactly. It's like magnitudes of bad, right? And I didn't check this one either.
That one has native here.
It's native here, fantastic. Instead of Karl Foerster, which I don't know about you, but we have had an invasion from Karl in Colorado. It is everywhere. It's usually Russian sage and Karl Foerster everywhere in all of our areas. And so add a little diversity by including another upright, beautiful, but even better fall color plant, Schizachrium scoparium. So, in fact, there's a couple of our native birds that will, because this is so dense, they'll nest inside. And so it's a great habitat provider. All right, so just a couple things about, and then I'm just going to briefly mention my science, since I can't help it. I'm a scientist as a professor. I'm just going to mention a little bit of my science, and then we'll have questions. And we can continue the conversation afterwards as well, like Sharon had said. So what we did was, oh, I thought I changed this slide. I didn't. We actually wrote a a grant for our Colorado Department of Agriculture. It was funded a few years ago. We did 3 summers of a study trying to look at what different treatments in containers result in healthier, hopefully, Colorado native plants so that they would get sold in the nursery a little faster. So our biggest thing was plant size and, of course, flowering. Those are the 2 things people look at. When you go look at 25 plants in a garden center of the same species, you pick the one that's the biggest, healthiest, or flowering usually. I'd rather not do the flowering because usually that means that plant is not in the right state to be transplanted, but that's neither here nor there. So what we did was we asked growers nationwide about a series of plants, native plants, and how they got them to look good in containers. So we weren't asking about propagation. So we weren't asking about how do you get them to grow, how do you get the cuttings to take root. That's not the problem for a lot of these plants. The problem is getting them in a condition that looks good enough for the home gardener, no matter if they're experienced or not, to pick them up and take them home. So we did a series of 3 studies in the summer. Oh, I left that in. I just did it again, sorry. So what we did was, based on those surveyors, or the survey of those growers, we actually did a 5 treatment. So we looked at a typical mix. This is just a peat mix that you get, like potting mix that you get at Home Depot. We added to that control, that was our control, we added to that mix sand, because drainage was one of the things that kept coming up amongst growers. They said, well, you need increased drainage. That's how you get native plants to look good. Is our peat substrates are not good. Okay. Another one is having some mycorrhizae and beneficial bacteria. So this is a product that can be purchased throughout most of the West called Command. It's not cheap, just to warn you. But we added it 15% by volume to the control as one of our treatments. We just did regular compost, because that was a thing that kept coming up in, not necessarily amongst the growers, but amongst a lot of the literature. And then native soil, that kept coming up. People kept saying we need to add native soils to our results, or to our substrates, so that our plants look good. We are analyzing that data. We literally just harvested the last round last week, my graduate student and I. The quick version is, depending on the species, because we had 12 different species, they either preferred Command or sand treatments over any other treatments. And when I say they preferred, they grew faster, had flowers form sooner or more abundantly, and end up having a larger biomass. So it's not just the size of the plant necessarily, because you can have a super thin, spindly plant that's big, but then it may not have a lot of biomass. So we are working on that right now.
May I ask?
Yeah.
I was interpreting that as being a complete recipe. Are those separate instances?
Good question. These are all separate. So these are separate treatments, and these little percentages I put behind each one is what we added into the mix.
Okay.
So we have control to be able to say, all right, this is the difference between these treatments.
Okay, thank you.
So it's not additive. Good question. And they're mixed entirely by volume. And so the part of the reason of the 10% by volume instead of a higher percent of native soils has to do with the weight. Our native soils, at least in Colorado, are very heavy. They're clayey soils, so they're super heavy. Growers are not going to ship something that's too heavy. That's too expensive for them to ship. So, and this has actually been the worst treatment, believe it or not. We've actually had death and slower growth, we think, because it's not, these mixes are all, have all been heat treated to prevent any pathogens from getting to the roots. So I get a little excited. And then here's where my graduate students have stared at, literally staring at plants, watching pollinators. So this is Michael at the Botanic Gardens. There he is with that Ipomopsis I was mentioning earlier. He's actually taking nectar out of that flower. He had covered it the night before. And then so that the insects didn't come steal it from us, so we could collect that data. So he has a tiny little glass tube that he's sucking the nectar out of. He blows it on a little screen on a Brix meter. So think when winemakers try to harvest grapes at the right time, the right sugar content, that's what they use as a Brix meter. And so he would blow it on there, and we would measure the relative concentration of sugar. We're actually about to publish this, so this is further along. And what he found here was a larger volume and concentration of sugar for this same set of plants on the green roof versus on the ground. So we're getting pretty excited about that work. And then this student is following up on that. Here's his green roof research. He has a plot just like at Salud, about 50 meters away. And we measure all kinds of scientific things, but I won't bore you with all of that. But yep, we stare at plants to watch them, watch pollinators visit them. So just a couple of papers that I want to mention, publications I want to mention. Of course, Common Southwestern Native Plants, available here. I give lots of these talks just so we can sell more. I've also published a couple chapters in a book, Eco-Regional Green Roofs, with a dear colleague of mine at A&M, Texas A&M, and then we wrote a paper on the 118 plants that were up on that green roof. It's this green roof right here at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And so we literally go through and report on